Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti, Amen. Veni Sancti Spiritus Repletuorum Corda Fidelium, et Tuia Moris Reis in Macende, Metis Spiritum Tuum et Creaventur.
Et in nobis faciem te.
Oremus Deus, qui Corda Fidelium, Sancti Spiritus illustratione docubisti, da nobis iniodem Spiritu rectus apere, et te eius semper consolatione godere per Christum Dominum nostrum.
Amen.
Sede sapientiae.
Ora pro nobis.
In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Two copies, let's see. I mean, you've got just one. It's not filling in extra copies.
I can help.
All right. All right, so page 77. Talking about the reign of Clement III and the beginnings of the Third Crusade, which is, as far as church history is concerned, much more really of a military event than things we usually cover, but it's quite interesting, and certain things we'll cover on this. So the German army, so they were talking about, yes, it was certain very famous events and very famous personages are associated with the Third Crusade. When you're studying history, you're really studying history, even if it's church history. That's the main focus, of course, but has mainly the problems the church has suffered is what it turns out to be usually. But ultimately, studying history is studying history. Nothing happens in isolation. So sometimes, yes, we branch off into other areas, such as in this case, talking about the Third Crusade, in order to have an understanding of the backdrop of things that are happening in the church at the time. And of course, the Crusades are something that the church very much approved of in principle, not necessarily of everything done by every crusader on every crusade, of course, but in general, in principle, the Crusades are justified, and so it's of interest to us to see what kind of military operation it is that the church actually positively calls for and approves of. So we're talking about the fact that this is not the first time, but that the Greeks, the Byzantines, were giving trouble to the progress of the crusade. Among other things, the German army, led by Barbarossa, the Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, the same one who had caused so much trouble previously, had ravaged northern Italy, had set up anti-popes, at least one, if not more, but definitely had fostered schism, given all kinds of trouble to the Holy See. It is now he who, having seen the error of his past ways, is now spearheading a crusade to recover the Holy Land, to return Jerusalem to the control of those who hold the faith. So the German army found its march retarded by broken roads, dearth of provisions, so severe lack thereof, the military occupation of material obstruction of the mountain passes. The ambassadors sent by Frederick to complain at Constantinople of these hostile proceedings were thrown into a dungeon. In the transport of indignation excited by this infamous violation of international law, the Crusaders called aloud to be led against Constantinople to avenge the honor of the Christian name. So notice that the Fourth Crusade would eventually attack Constantinople and infamously sack it, but it wasn't the first time that somebody had gotten upset with Constantinople. There's nothing but a source of trouble. We saw that in earlier sections of church history, but they started out, of course, the East was originally the center of civilization, in fact. The fact that Rome became the ruling power of the world was something of an anomaly. Rome started out as a backwater city built in a swamp, which still is, of course, still a low-lying area. But at the time, in the ancient world, Rome was very much a backwater in just about every sense. the Western Europe, generally speaking, was, in a sense, the Wild West. Now, the center of civilization was the Middle East. And so Constantinople, of course, being at the center of all that was, well, that's part of the reason why the Emperor Constantine moved the capital from Rome, the capital of the empire from Rome to Constantinople, was to be nearer the center of civilization, from which Rome was relatively far. I mean, even today, you wouldn't say that's close. You wouldn't say that Rome and, they call it today Istanbul, you wouldn't say that they're close. But in the ancient world, it would have taken, of course, much longer to travel between the two of them. And Constantinople, Istanbul, whatever you call it, being very much the gateway from Europe into Asia, specifically Asia Minor, but very much the gateway into the Middle East. And so there were a multitude of reasons why Constantine wanted to have his capital there, but one of them was just to be nearer the center of civilization. But things obviously have fallen a long way since then, even by the time we're looking at. That there are, of course, many saints to come from that area, many saints in the east. But as we saw that very clearly, that as time went on, fewer and fewer saints emerged, and more trouble was produced, to the point that it became nothing but a source of trouble and schism and heresy too, and now trouble to the Crusades. So now Constantinople is nothing but a source of trouble and would remain nothing but a source of trouble. So we'll see that it would end quite badly. The Byzantine Empire would end, in all things considered, quite badly. It's, by this point, a shadow of its former self. Yes, there is still an emperor, but at this point is better thought of as the mayor of Constantinople in terms of his power. Yes, there was, by this point, we have to look at the exact map of the empire at this time, but there's probably more territory than just Constantinople itself, but being very much set upon by Muslims in the East at this point. And so, but yeah, best to think of the emperor as the Byzantine emperor as the mayor of Constantinople. So, they got upset. Barbarossa's soldiers got upset, and something that you think Barbarossa might go for. Oh yes, go and destroy the city. Obviously, has destroyed cities before. But he was no longer the emperor who could vent a fit of rage by the destruction of cities and pass the plowshare over the smoldering site of Milan. So he's put that behind him. Sincere faith had opened his heart to sentiments of true greatness, so it seems. Obviously, we leave it to God to ultimately to judge that, but to outward appearances, yes, he really has been reformed. He pacified his followers, reminding them that the end of their pilgrimage was Jerusalem, not Byzantium. So they're not the target here. Something that the Fourth Crusade should have kept in mind. So, through all the obstacles thrown in his path by Greek treachery, he made his way to Adrianople. Isaac Angelus was too sanguine when he wrote to Saladin, "I have made the European pilgrims powerless, I have clipped the wings of their victories." So, not only is he an emperor whose power is a shadow of emperors who have come before him, but also a braggart who is saying things that are just not true. He did not do that. Whatever Constantinople is capable of, not of crippling the German army of the Third Crusade, that's for sure. So he speedily released the ambassadors of Frederick, who exclaimed on beholding them again, "I thank God who has given me back my sons." Isaac now sought to make a treaty of peace with the German emperor, but notice that as soon as he says that to he writes to Saladin, the Sultan, the Muslim Sultan, that he's bragging about having arrested completely the progress of the European Crusaders. But then as soon as Barbarossa puts pressure on him, he just gives up immediately those envoys whom he had unjustly imprisoned. So he's a rat, obviously, which is not surprising. That a rat emerged from Constantinople is like saying there's a rat in the sewers. I mean, tell me something I can't already guess. Right, so Isaac was now sought to make a treaty of peace with the German emperor. The Greek deputies thus addressed Frederick. No, so you can read the groveling language that they use. Or actually, in this case, not groveling. In this case, it's haughty, very haughty language. "The holy emperor, our master, expects you to swear fealty to him as your suzerain," so overlord. And this was demanded by Greek emperors in the past to crusaders passing through, demanding that as a part of their tribute that they had to pay for passing through their territory, to swear fealty, which is ridiculous. He said, notice the emperor, Frederick's answer that I too am an emperor by the election of my subjects and the confirmation of the pope, but mindful of my sins, I do not claim the title of holiness. I mean, being a schismatic, the Greek emperor can't claim that either, of course. The toils in which you think to have bound us, we shall break as we would a cobweb. So notice, Barbarossa has actually prevented his own men from attacking Constantinople, and now has to answer this in return. Are they thankful for that? No, they're demanding oaths of fealty as part of tribute just for passing through. That's the state of the Greek Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire, as it fancies itself at this point. So Isaac deemed it prudent not to bring the storm upon his already crumbling empire. And yeah, crumbling is the right way to describe it. He promised to furnish a sufficient number of vessels to transport the Crusaders to the shores of Asia, betrothed his daughter to Prince Philip, who was, for Prince Philip, a son of the German emperor, and pledged himself by oath in the Church of St. Sophia faithfully to fulfill every article of the treaty. So the army embarked at Gallipoli. Does anybody know anything else famous about Gallipoli? Yes.
Winston Churchill's most famous defeat.
Arguably, yes. Arguably. Definitely one of his terrible military ideas. Does anybody know where? Well, I guess we can point out. So I took this map down. The Gallipoli, yes, was. It's hard to see it there, but it's very much the gateway on the Dardanelles Straits into, well, the Turkish Empire at the time, which was in World War I allied to Germany and Austria. The idea was the British and French could not defeat Germany directly on the Western Front. Things were static there, so they decided to attack from someplace else. And the idea was to attack the weakest ally of Germany, which was the Turkish Empire, and by that to distract Germany and weaken by one of its weaker allies falling apart, and to cause trouble for them that way. And yes, they landed at Gallipoli, which you probably can't see it here, but it's a little too far away, I guess. But right there, and but that didn't even work. Yes, it was in fact a failure. And there was another name though associated with that whole thing, another famous name, what would become very famous later on. Does anybody know who that was? Probably multiple ones, but there are two. Yes, Churchill's one. There's another one that comes to mind on the Turkish side in this case. Mustafa Kemal Ataturk. Does the name ring any bells? He became
president of Turkey?
Yes, because Turkey being on the losing side of World War I, the empire, the Ottoman Empire, was in fact brought to an end, but you still obviously have the modern-day modernized Republic of Turkey, and yes, it secularized itself, and it's still a Muslim state, essentially, in the sense of who's ruling it, but very much secularized, to the point, actually, that all religious garb was forbidden to be worn. And by Ataturk himself, from Mustafa Kemal Ataturk. And that was actually, a third name is now associated with it, not with the operations of the First World War, but another name comes up in connection with all that. Does anybody know who that was? It was Roncalli, actually, who was he was, in the 1920s and 30s, he was very much shunted off to the side. He was already known to be bad, but he wasn't reduced to the lay state and excommunicated for doing certain things. Instead, he was made the legate to Turkey, which was not exactly prime prime real estate, so to speak, of ecclesiastical offices. That was he was essentially banished first to Bulgaria and then to Turkey. And it was while he was in Turkey that, yes, Ataturk, as the president, banned all religious garb from being worn in public. And his idea was to not to have Turkey be seen as a militant Islamic state anymore, but he went to the point of forbidding any religious garb to be worn in public. And so Roncalli could just conform to that. And during what must have been an absolutely bizarre ceremony, but apparently at the beginning of Vespers, one day he had all the clergy process in their usual ecclesiastical attire, but then at the end of the ceremony they came out all wearing lay clothes. And he just went along with that. It's one of the things on Roncalli's record. But it was after that he was plucked from obscurity He was already a bishop, so it was only in so much obscurity, but he was plucked from that and then sent to Paris by Pius XII to be the legate to Paris, which is the top diplomatic position in the church. Was later made a cardinal by Pius XII. So other popes had him sent away, and he was not disciplined as he ought to have been, but he was still shunted off to the side, definitely. Whereas Pius XII set him up. He would not have been, no way he would have been elected in 1958 had it not been for the fact that Pius XII set him up. That just has to be laid at Pius XII's feet, yes.
If a cleric is in a country like Roncalli was, where ecclesiastical garb is banned, what are you supposed to comply with that or no?
It depends. Yeah, you have to look at all the details of it, read the entire story. Yeah, it was scandalous the way he handled it. Yeah, that's for another section of church history to cover. But the whole way it was done was terrible. We covered that a few years ago. Anybody who may have been here for that remembers that it was, when you look at the details of it, it was not properly handled. Now, it can happen, yes, that priests sometimes cannot wear a clerical garb in public to avoid persecution. That can be justified. But this was beyond just that. Clearly, it was beyond it. Actually, in some places, there still are laws on the books prohibiting clerical garb. For example, in Mexico, those laws are still technically on the books forbidding clerical garb. That's why, actually, for a long time, it was the custom in Mexico for priests not just to wear a clerical suit, but to just wear a regular business suit. So a priest would just look like a businessman on the streets, because they had to wear that kind of clothing to avoid being detected previously, during the 1920s and 30s, if they wore a cassock on the streets, which is normal in Spanish-speaking countries. That's, as far as ecclesiastical discipline is concerned, yes, they think to wear on the streets in Spanish-speaking countries is the cassock. But if they had done that during those times, they would have been taken up immediately and shot by that absolutely horrible government. So that's how that custom came about. But again, it's not enforced anymore. That has gone by the wayside. The persecution of the church in a bloody manner is no longer taking place in Mexico. So Father Severino, when he goes back to Mexico, for example, he wears the cassock on the streets. Then he doesn't get any trouble for it. So that's good, at least. But that was the custom for a long time for that reason. So it's not completely unjustifiable that clergy sometimes cannot wear the clerical garb that they really ideally ought to be wearing, but Roncalli, the way he handled it was just the worst. You have to look at the details of the scenario, which we're not going into at the moment. But yes, that was in fact very, very badly handled. So that was Roncalli in Turkey prior to being sent to Paris. Yes.
I guess another question I have, Father, would be: is it a legitimate law for the state to say that?
No.
Oh.
No. The church, the state can forbid other fake religions from manifesting themselves publicly, but no state can prevent the church from enacting its legitimate disciplines anywhere. No, the state has no authority to do that. So anyway, yeah, there's a lot more you could say about that, but all right, that's also, yes. So I mentioned Gallipoli. Okay, so Frederick was the last to quit the shores of Europe and entered his boat only when the last soldier was fairly embarked upon the fleet. So, okay, as they stepped out upon the sands of Asia, he addresses his troops, and our author likes to give all of the details of all these kinds of things. But the fact of the matter is, yes, his crusade was proceeding quite successfly, taking down, as our author mentions, tens of thousands of enemies as they proceed. He was also accompanied by his son, Philip, mentioned him, Philip, Duke of Swabia. And so moving on from there. Yeah, the account our author gives is quite dramatic. We just don't need to read every word of it here. So I have won victories as they proceeded at Iconium. The way to Palestine was open. The day of Jerusalem's redemption seemed again to dawn. Saladin himself, dismayed by this is the top of page 79. Saladin himself, dismayed by the news of the brilliant victory, sent ambassadors to Frederick to ask for peace and promised the restitution of the holy places. Yet all this glorious success was doomed to a fruitless end. When the army reached Kidnus, Frederick, heedless of the entreaties of his followers, spurred his steed into the waves, which had already well nigh proved fatal to another hero. Though covered with sweat, the intrepid old warrior would swim the stream, so he was intent on doing that. His strength failed him before he reached the shore, and the icy billows of the Kidnus rolled above the lifeless form of Frederick Barbarossa. So yes, very famously, he either fell from his horse or died swimming across his river. But in any case, he died in the river. And after that, his crusade didn't exactly stop, but it lost its momentum for sure. So as our author points out, the deepest consternation and despair seized upon the German army. They had lost their emperor, their general, their father. The echo of their groans and lamentations resounded through all of Europe. Frederick of Swabia took command of the bereaved army, and himself died like a hero before the walls of Ptolemais, which is the city of Acre. But he could not revive the genius of his father. The death of Frederick left the German army, or empire, the army, yes, was Frederick, but left the German empire in the hands of Henry VI, who inherited only his father's faults and showed himself the most inveterate enemy of the Holy See. Pope Clement III hardly outlived Frederick Barbarossa. He died on the 25th of March, 1191, just as through his means Philip Augustus and Richard Coeur de Lion, or in English, the Lion-Hearted, were setting sail for Palestine. So I'll move on to Celestine III, who was Cardinal Hyacinth, a member of the powerful family of the Orsini, that's the name you see coming up sometimes, was raised to the chair of St. Peter as the successor to Clement III. The first act of his pontificate was a solemn coronation of Henry VI and the Empress Constance. The new Caesar pledged himself to the Pope to respect all the rights of the Roman Church, to follow in his rule the laws of justice and right, and to restore all the estates unjustly wrested by his predecessors from the patrimony of St. Peter. But he soon forgot his oath. So that was convenient. Forgot. Obviously, that's not quite what the author means, but he didn't live up to it, is the point. So they've had now 3 Henrys in a row, 3rd Emperor Henry in a row, to be nothing but trouble to the church. The whole attention of Europe was now fixed upon the crusade. As its future historian, William, Archbishop of Tyre, had preached it in England and in France, period there. He related to astonished Europe the woes of the East and the cruel disasters he had himself witnessed. Philip Augustus entrusted, King Philip Augustus of France, that is, entrusted the government of his kingdom to Queen Adele, his mother, and his uncle, the Archbishop of Reims. Richard left the regency of the English realm to his chancellor, William de Longchamp, Bishop of Ely. That's how you pronounce that. That's a town in England, Ely. Don't ask why it's pronounced that way. It just is. Never ask about English place names. There are reasons, but you never figure them out. It's Ely. It's pronounced Ely. The 2 kings had agreed to meet with their respective forces at Vézelay. The fate of the first 2 crusades, with the more recent experience of Frederick Barbarossa, convinced the Europeans that they could no longer trust the degenerate Greeks of Constantinople. And indeed, they do well not to do that. The Fourth Crusade would not pay heed to that lesson, unfortunately. So they determined to go by sea and by the port of Messina, and the port of Messina was appointed as the place of general embarkation. Since the capital of Jerusalem, Guy of Lusignan, so was the king of Jerusalem, released from Saladin's fetters, had succeeded in gathering together 9,000 warriors, the last remains of so many proud hosts, whose bones lay bleaching beneath the rays of the Syrian sun. This was a small force to stand against the whole of Asia and against Egypt too, whose united powers obeyed the orders of Saladin. So Lusignan hoped against hope and led his little band to the siege of the immense city of Ptolemais, or Acre. This is the famous Siege of Acre. That's one of the defining moments of the Third Crusade, and we'll see why. The peasant fleet, equipped in the pontificate of Gregory VIII, joined him here, and soon afterwards, 12,000 warriors from Friesland and Denmark unfurled their banners beside those of the King of Jerusalem. Another fleet landed more than 20,000 Flemings under James d'Avesnes, who already renowned in the Lombard Wars, was already renowned in the Lombard Wars and destined to win the martyr's palm on the soil of Palestine. Sources are out there. You have to see exactly the circumstances of that, and if it's meant in a technical sense or not. But in any case, nearly 60,000 warriors lay encamped about the walls of Ptolemais. Calls it the fearless daring of Guy of Lusignan was rewarded. So someone who is not usually looked upon too highly, Guy of Lusignan, because he was the king who got captured and then After that, Jerusalem itself got captured, eventually surrendered. But it was doing something here, so it's at least that. In any case, on learning of the arrival of this immense armament, Saladin hastened forward with a countless horde of Egyptians, Arabs, and Syrians. The Saracens encamped around the Christian leaguer like a belt. The besiegers were themselves besieged. So this sometimes happens. This is why the Romans had the practice of building typically 2 walls around any place that they besieged. They would build one wall facing inwards to enclose the place they were besieging, and sometimes would build another one facing outwards to prevent anyone from attacking them from outside. But they clearly didn't do that here. They didn't have the resources to do that, these crusaders here. So that didn't happen. So you have a double siege going on. There's one of the city and another of the besiegers of the city. So rings within rings of siege here, wheels within wheels of this situation. So the plain before Acre was made a battlefield, which revived the prodigies of valor and heroic feats of Homer's warriors in the siege of Troy, or whatever. Our author likes to say things like that, right? I guess it's not completely inappropriate, but why reference them? Is what? Anyway, so the fate of the world was to be decided on this confined and narrow theater. Yeah, that maybe is a little overdramatic, but you get what he's going for. Certainly it would have seemed that way to everybody there. Things were in this state when Philip Augustus, and soon after him Richard Coeur de Lion, or Lionhearted, landed at Ptolemais. So this reinforcement decided the chances of war in favor of the Crusaders. So first you have a city that was besieged by a relatively small force that was reinforced, and then after that, a force that goes to besiege them and trying to reinforce those who were in the besieged city, and now you have another force reinforcing the besiegers of the city who are themselves, in some sense, besieged as well. That's how war works oftentimes. So Philip Augustus, so this is, keep in mind here that this author, whenever there's somebody he likes, he it covers up that person's faults as absolutely much as possible. Sometimes he has to acknowledge them grudgingly in order to explain things that happened, but keep in mind there are other things in addition to what we see mentioned here that actually happened. So yeah, keep in mind this, he even has a certain liking for Saladin, actually, who was... may have been noble for a sultan, but was definitely, I'll say, not without certain issues. We'll say, even in that capacity. Obviously, being a Muslim is a whole problem on its own, but even aside from that, so the author here likes to wax poetic in describing anybody he likes, and it's true that Saladin, generally speaking, is held as somebody who was fairly noble, but yeah, moving on from that. He gives all kinds of details here, which are interesting, very definitely interesting to read, but we don't need to dwell too much upon them. So Ptolemais, or Acre, our author likes to use the term Ptolemais here, really is most often referred to as the city of Acre, spelled A-C-R-E. That's most often you see this referred to, but anyway. It did suffer fearfully from famine. The Christian squadron blocked the harbor. The army cut off all communications with the continent. After a resistance of 2 years, the city offered to capitulate. Notice that sometimes sieges can go on for years. Depends on how well supplied the city is and how well defended, but yes, that can happen. A siege can last for years. Much of the time it's just sitting there, hoping that the other will, one or the other, either the besieged or the besiegers will just give up. Much of a siege is precisely that. So, but sometimes it can be broken by, yes, an assault or any number of different things, but oftentimes it's just a waiting game with different skirmishes and being involved. I think it depends on the siege. The siege of Jerusalem involved, for example, one of those famous sieges in history involved a great many engagements, great many battles within that overall campaign that was the siege, but something like this, maybe not, it depends. You have to take case by case, but after a resistance of 2 years, they offered to capitulate with a promise to restore the true cross taken by Saladin in the last war, to set at liberty 1,600 Christian prisoners and to pay 200,000 pieces of gold. So a Muslim soldier succeeded in passing through the Christian camp and carried the news to Saladin, who wept with grief at the tidings. He called his emirs to a council. But at the moment of their meeting, the standard of the cross appeared upon the towers of Ptolemais. So the besieged eventually gave up. Saladin was not able to break through. Sometimes that happens in sieges as well, that a force reinforcing, or seeks to relieve anyway, the besieged, cannot break through the besiegers. And that was the case here. Due to reinforcements, the English and French armies arriving to reinforce the besiegers, but in fact was not able to break through, clearly, and the city of Acre was taken. So the surrender of Ptolemais was the signal for Philip Augustus to forsake the army of the cross and to return to France. Yes, this was, by all accounts, our author says here, and you have to take it with a grain of salt because he is a French author, but by all accounts, it is in fact true that it was, Richard just was one of those personalities who couldn't get along with anybody else. He was used to having his own way and everything, a very fiery personality, and easily would fight with anybody. If it wasn't a war, then it was a personal scuffle of some kind, or he was just very hot-headed. He was very much prone to that sort of thing. And so yes, he alienated Philip Augustus at some point. I don't recall the exact details, but by all accounts, it was Richard's abrasive personality that caused Philip Augustus to say, I can't do this anymore. I can't work with this guy anymore, essentially, and decide to go back home. So whether or not he should have done that is another thing, but by all accounts, Richard was hard to work with. So Philip's feelings towards the English king were shared by several other princes. The Archduke Leopold of Austria, we mentioned at this point, Austria is a duchy or an archduchy. In this case, yes, he is an archduke. The Archduke Leopold of Austria showed him a most marked aversion, and afterward displayed his jealous anger against Richard, more like a pirate than a Christian prince. So, when it comes to these things, people falling out, disliking each other, there's a whole, you have to take into account a whole number of different things. So who was actually at fault or who wasn't. But the point is they all fell out. So this is why, you see, at the beginning of this Third Crusade, it would seem impossible that it would not succeed with the German Emperor, the Holy Roman Emperor, kings of England and France, and the throne, the Duke of Austria as well, or the Archduke. You'd think this could only ever succeed, but it fell apart by degrees. And it didn't completely end at this point. Richard led it on himself. But we'll see how that ended ultimately. So these intestine strifes, so internal strifes, did not lessen the ardor of the lion-hearted monarch. It's true he was no less resolved for that, even if he'd alienated everybody else. Under his command, the army advanced to Joppa, in the forest of Orsur. 200,000 Turks, led by Saladin, opposed the passage of the Christian host. The shock was fearful. Richard was ever found where the Christian army was weakest. Everywhere the flight of Turks announced his presence and marked his passage. So no Saracen, say the contemporary chroniclers, could stand before him. He moved about in this fearful fray like a harvester, mowing down the standing grain. So by all accounts, he was heavily involved personally. He was very much a frontline general, as it were. That was actually how he would end up dying. He would end up it was a siege in France, so this was after this was all over. But he ended up getting shot by a crossbowman in France and died from that. So he was very much always on the front lines of whatever military operation it is he was carrying on. For better or worse, he was very much involved in it. So his battle cry, God, help the Holy Sepulchre, spread dismay and terror through the enemy's ranks. The Battle of Orsur cost Saladin 8,000 of his warriors and 32 emirs. The Christians lost but 1,000 men. So it's still a lot of people, but in terms of the numbers involved, that's a relatively small number. The victory of Orsur was a fruitless one, for Saladin, hopeless of defending Joppa, had left it in ruins. So he was adopting something of a scorched earth policy, as they call it. Sometimes retreating armies will do that. If they can't defend something, or they can't bring it with them, and that could apply to a city or to stores of resources and whatnot, but sometimes, or just to the capability of producing anything on the land, sometimes armies will adopt what is called a scorched earth policy, which means sometimes literally leaving burnt earth behind them, or all kinds of burnt buildings and even whole cities behind them, just to prevent the enemy from taking advantage of it. So that's a pretty common tactic in warfare. In the cases of those who have to abandon a place that they really don't want to have to give up, really don't want to fall into anyone else's hands, and similar situations. So he did that to the city of Joppa. All its towers and battlements were dismantled, the country was deserted, and the Christian army thus found itself in the midst of a barren waste, destitute of provisions, exhausted by the burning heat of the climate, and incessantly harassed by the Arabs and Saracens, unseen foes, always inflicting hurt but always safe from pursuit. So yes, that's certainly, let's say, light horse archeries and things like that they could use to inflict damage, not fatal damage, but just constantly inflict casualties on an advancing slower force. So to crown all these misfortunes, Guy of Lusignan was no more, and ambitious pretenders drew their swords to dispute a nominal heritage. He says the fictitious royalty of Jerusalem, fictitious in the sense that that was the title of King of Jerusalem, was obviously not something that carried with it any real power anymore, Jerusalem being lost at this point. So in this trying juncture, the conduct of Richard was even above, he says, even above his heroic fame. So yeah, our author here, he happens to like Richard, so he covers up anything bad he may have done. He did slaughter prisoners at one point. It was in response to, I don't remember all the details, but it was in response to something else, something similar on the other side. Again, I don't remember the details, but he did that, and that's laid at his feet. And yes, keep in mind, there are typically in wars atrocities on both sides. Even in the case in which one side is fighting a just war, still there are typically atrocities on that side. It's very common. So, and oftentimes it's used subsequently, or even at the time, to attack the justice of the cause by the enemies, by the opposing side. And so it might sometimes be used as a case in point for a war being carried out unjustly, but even when it's the exception, it still is always brought up as, look at this horrible thing they did. And so you might see, that's one of those things you see commonly brought up against crusades. But again, the response is that today's world has no business being horrified at any of the atrocities of the past. And again, we can talk about universally outlawing abortion and artificial birth control and divorce and remarriage, and then we can start talking about making reparation for all those things, for the allowance of all those things for many, many decades now, and then we can start talking about being horrified about past atrocities. Until then, no, let's not hear of it. Yeah, I have just a further, much of what we have here is just further description of the events of the crusade. Okay. Such was the terror inspired by Coeur de Lion, the lion-hearted, that for a century after the crusade, his tremendous name was employed by the Syrian mothers to silence their unruly infants. And if a horse suddenly started from the way, his Saracen rider was wont to chide him with the exclamation, "Fool, dost thou think that King Richard is in that bush?" All right, this is a pretty common thing. There is a famous saying in ancient Rome, "Hannibal ad portas," which meant Hannibal at the gates. Hannibal never actually got to Rome. He never besieged Rome or anything. But the Romans he was the one who really, probably of all the enemies fought by the ancient Romans, at least up until the empire started falling apart, barbarians, generally speaking, started making all kinds of inroads into the empire. Hannibal was their most formidable opponent, by far. And so they were always, also his father, Hamilcar, was quite formidable too, but he became something of a boogeyman, as it were, for them. And they would, if they wanted to really raise the alarm, they would say Hannibal at the gates. That would be guaranteed to get their attention. If he was at the gates, that meant things were really bad. He defeated them repeatedly. And the Romans were used to just walking over anybody they fought. And he actually used that against them. And he had fewer men typically going up against them, but they were used to winning by strength of numbers, which usually worked. So they kept all their troops in this huge formation. But the fact of the matter is, if you keep your troops in a huge block then obviously only the outer rim of any of the group can do anything. And so he would surround them with a smaller force, but he would just mow them down gradually. He would trap them. He trapped their larger force. For one famous instance, he had them trapped between the sea on one side and mountains on the other, and just hemmed them in and just destroyed them completely. So he definitely was more clever than they were. He was definitely cleverer. Even so, they eventually defeated him. But in any case, he was. This happens sometimes. Some strong personality, some successful enemy will oftentimes become the boogeyman for a long time, for potentially an entire nation. So you can come up with various examples of that from history, but this is just one of them. So in the spring of the year 1192, the English monarch learned while on the plains of Ascalon that his unprincipled brother John had profited by his absence to seize his state. So yes, this is the King John of England, who would eventually, he was clearly unpopular, always unpopular, and he was the one against whom the nobles of England would eventually rise up and demand that he sign the Magna Carta as a condition of their not causing any more trouble, essentially. The Magna Carta, which would actually be condemned by the Pope at the time. So we'll see that later on. But the point is, he was always unpopular. And he's just one of those people with an immediately bad reputation in history. And as oftentimes happens, sometimes people with bad reputations may or may not deserve them to the fullest extent to which they have them, but he's definitely one of the ones who has it, whether accurately or not. He's the one who has it. He actually had the nickname Lackland because he had older brothers who got all the territory ahead of him, and so it was John Lackland, the one who doesn't have any territory. Of course, he ended up becoming the king eventually, so he got it all ultimately. But that was his nickname for a while, John Lackland, the guy who doesn't have any territory. Okay. So, where were you there? Yes. No. Imagine that you're all fighting a crusade and you realize that your brother at home is causing trouble. Family problems at the highest level here. So the hero then acquainted the council of chiefs that the interests of his own crown recalled him to the west, but he first wished to look upon Jerusalem, which he had not yet had time to conquer. Ascending in the heights of Emmaus, he contemplated the walls and towers of the holy city, which protected Saladin with his 200,000 warriors. So at the sight of the august city, Richard burst into tears, and covering his face with his shield, said, "I am unworthy to gaze upon the walls of Jerusalem, which my arms have not been able to rescue." So when Saladin wished for peace, his arm, now weakened by the weight of years, found the sword of war too heavy for its failing strength. A truce of 4 years was concluded between the King of England and the Sultan. Jerusalem was to be left open to the devotion of the Christians, who might also hold the seacoast from Joppa to Tyre. The city of Ascalon, which was by its position the key of Egypt, became an object of contention between the Crusaders and the Turks. To settle the dispute, it was agreed to destroy the city. So, that's not the greatest solution, to say the least, but sometimes people decide upon things like that. What were they thinking after the fact? The Third Crusade was at an end, left to the Latins of Est Kingdom in the east. So this result, although incomplete, yet worthily crowned so many deeds of warlike prowess and prodigious daring. Saladin himself did not live to enjoy his triumph, but died at Damascus in 1193. So yes, he himself died not long after. So who knows if John hadn't caused trouble at home for Richard, what might have happened. But in fact, as we know from all the rest is in fact history at this point. So we know that Jerusalem actually remained part of the Turkish Empire until after World War I. It was only after that they started at the Treaty of Versailles. So that's a treaty that, of course, it's immediately obvious led directly into World War II, but it has effects to this very day. I mean, that was where the map of the Middle East was drawn, was at Versailles. And it was the double dealing. The British were promising a kingdom to the Arabs in the Ottoman Empire, and keep in mind it's not really clear on this map here, but it might be clearer on this one. That's not going to move. the Turkish Empire, which included, of course, that's modern day Turkey, it extended all the way down to Egypt. So it was a very extensive empire. And yeah, definitely including all these cities we're looking at now, Jerusalem itself. And so you can see all these names we're talking about, you can see them all right there. But yeah, Jerusalem would in fact remain under the control of the Turks until after World War I, when there was the Arabs rose up very famously at the instigation of Lawrence of Arabia, Captain T.E. Lawrence, who pretty much went native amongst the Arabs. And he was the one who stirred all that up. And that was all manufactured. And the Arabs, they didn't like the Turks, but it took a British officer, an Englishman, to go and really get them organized. Even then, they were bickering amongst themselves, but that's what it took to get them organized to rise up against the Turks. It was all with the idea of causing problems for Germany. And whether or not it made a tremendous difference in the overall war is a separate question, but definitely it gave rise to the capability of the British and French to, the British to, while promising the Arabs, that's how they got them to rise up, said, if you rise up against the Turks and cause trouble for Germany, that we will give you an independent Arab kingdom in the Middle East. And so they were promising that to the Arabs on the one hand, while on the other hand, together with the French, dividing up in what's called the Sykes-Picot Treaty, named for the two diplomats who forged the treaty, agreed to divide the whole area into different zones of influence. So Syria would be under French influence, Iraq would be under British influence. The British eventually came into control of Egypt, and yeah, that sounds like you can picture the borders of the modern day states in those areas. Yeah, that's not by coincidence. That the Versailles Treaty was made all that official after the war was over. Wrote all of those borders, drew all those borders with a ruler clearly on a map. Borders don't form like that. They don't form perfectly straight lines typically. It can, but not typically. And definitely not in that part of the world. They don't form straight lines. But that's how those are all drawn in Paris in 1919. And all that friction in the Middle East to this day, that's all stems directly from that. And that, of course, in addition to that as well, the promise to give the Jews a nation, a state in that part of the world as well, of course, added to that. So while it was all Turkish Empire, it was relatively stable. It didn't have all the troubles that there are now. Because as always, when you have an imperial power, everybody in the empire might hate the imperial power, but at least they hate it more than they hate each other. They hate themselves, they hate each other too. All that fighting amongst different sects of Muslims, they have all hated each other since forever ago, but they at least were united in their hatred of Constantinople, which that's all the way up there. And that was the capital. It's not the capital of Turkey anymore, that's Ankara now. But that was the capital of the Turkish Empire for a long time. So when they finally took Constantinople in the 15th century, they made it the capital of their own empire. And ruled all of this territory, modern-day Iraq, Syria, Jordan, everything, all the way down to Egypt. They ruled all of that. It's quite extensive. But they became eventually, very famously, the sick man of Europe, falling apart. It became this crumbling empire because, well, you can see it here on this map. Keep in mind, they used to extend all the way down to Egypt. I can't recall whether it included Sinai specifically, but it used to extend all the way down to Egypt, and also used to border the Austrian Empire. That's extended deep into Asia, or in Asia Minor, maybe even a little into Africa, but also very far north into Europe. Remember, they besieged Vienna itself a couple of times. The Turks did. And so, all of this became known as the sick man of Europe because it went from all of this territory right here, from Romania, as it was at the time. The map of this part of the world looks very different now. But Romania, what's listed here is Romania, Bulgaria, Serbia, Bosnia, Montenegro, Greece, all of that was all Turkish Empire. But notice, this is from about, I can't remember the exact date that this map is from, but somewhere around 1900. All of that had been lost. And actually they continued losing even more after this. And Austria continued gobbling up different parts of that. And so, the sick man of Europe, everybody was seizing different pieces of it. So everybody knew that was an unstable region and might cause a war. And ultimately, yeah, it did. Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti mens sub tuum presidium configibus sancti Rei Genitrix, nostras peccationes et specias in necessitatibus, sera periculis contis libera nos semper, virgo glorios et benedicta. Amen. Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti.